Greetings, everyone. Welcome to episode 8 of Canadian Meets the South. Today I'll be reviewing two books, actually, the sequels to Gods and Generals. That would be, no, those would be The Killer Angels by Michael Shara and The Last Full Measure by Jeff Shara, his son. And I think I may have explained this in the previous episode, but The Killer Angels was written in the 1970s, like 1974, and got the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1975. It was, to Jeff Shara's way of putting it, um, telling history as a novel. And after The Killer Angels was adopted in as a movie, uh, titled Gettysburg in 1993, Jeff Shara decided to make it a trilogy and make a prequel and a sequel to The Killer Angels. The prequel, which I reviewed last episode, was Gods and Generals, and it was written in 1996 and got an adaptation in 2003. But The Last Full Measure, which was written in 1998, did not get an adaptation because of Gods and General's poor performance, the movie. So I'll just talk about my thoughts. This is maybe gonna be a little all over the place because it's two books at once, written by two authors, even though they are father and son. Um, but I'll try to keep it first about The Killer Angels and then later about The Last Full Measure. So, what I liked about both books is that they both made several references to Stonewall Jackson, even though he's dead for months in both of them. In The Killer Angels, he's been dead for about 2 months for the Battle of Gettysburg, sometime in 1863, because he died, I think, May 1863, and they still make the Confederates still make references to him. And he was considered the most talented man under Robert E. Lee. But it was when he died, like the clear second in command, the clear right hand man of Robert E. Lee was James Longstreet, whose nickname was Pete. He was from South Carolina. And what I found interesting was that it seemed that Europeans were observing both sides of the war. And one of the European men who was observing the war was Colonel Fremantle, who was with Longstreet's division, and Longstreet Longstreet remarked to his I think it was his chief of staff Sorrell, ridiculous. He, as in Fremantle, Colonel Fremantle, believes that it's all about slavery. And yeah, that was. And Colonel Fremantle had said that, yeah, this is what we Europeans think the war is about. And thinking about that time, there was a naval blockade. The Union had naval blockaded uh, the Confederate States. So they were getting desperate. There was no way to obviously to completely crush the Union. They were outnumbered, but they needed pressure to pressure the the Union. They needed to show a decisive win so that Abraham Lincoln would be pressured by the Northern people to stop the war, or at least because what they're hoping for at Gettysburg, they were invading, and there was a scene at the beginning in which Robert E. Lee grabs in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he grabs the soil and says, "I am the invader," because he's thinking, um, they were the one, the Union was the one, were the ones who invaded the southern states, and now he's invading Pennsylvania. His goal obviously was not to conquer Pennsylvania. It was really to show strength and to win a decisive battle against the Union, and so that they would so that the Union would stop the war. How many Union men were gonna die, and the Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest war, no, bloodiest battle in the history of America. Apparently, the battle was for 3 days, and obviously, Gods and Generals, it shows the perspective of multiple men, uh, in both the Union and the Confederacy, and um, one of the before I get to the Union, I'll talk about Lewis Armistead, who was um, who was General Winfield Scott Hancock's best friend, and they were positioned together in California. But then Lewis Armistead and General Albert Sidney Johnston from Texas, they decided to join the rebellion, and to his to Winfield Scott Hancock's sadness, I can't think of the word, but Lewis Armistead was fighting for Virginia, and the last time, that he meets with Hancock is on the battlefield of Gettysburg, and while they don't really meet, he dies, and Lewis Armistead charges, by his last charge was saying, "For Virginia," and yeah, he dies. He's mortally wounded, and then he asks, eh, um, while he on his while he's dying, he sees um a Union officer and asks what happened to Hancock, and the officer tells Armistead that Hancock has been mortally wounded. No, I mean not mortally wounded, and then so Armistead dies, not knowing that Hancock has been wounded, but not sure if he's gonna die, and it illustrates that the war, since it was a quote unquote civil war, Americans fighting each other, you would have friends on opposite sides of the war fighting, and also family members, brothers and cousins fighting on the other side of the war, and both the Union and the Confederate Army, they talked about how some men were fighting on the opposite side of the war from their brothers, and it's really sad that the war had done that, because this isn't a war against uh, another nation or another group, against like Great Britain or against Mexico. These are Americans fighting each other. So there was a lot of family bloodshed. Now talking about the Union side more. Yeah, Han- Hancock was a general, and at this point, um, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the professor from Maine, he he wasn't a he wasn't a general yet, and he becomes a colonel because the um, the colonel who leads, I don't know, I think it's the 20th of Maine, dies, so he becomes in command, and he and his brother Tom fight the uh, the the Battle of Gettysburg, and I think he holds the line against the the Confederates, and he their division, or I don't remember all the types of units there are, whatever a colonel heads, and it illustrates his Chamberlain's relationship with Buster Kilrain, who was even older than uh, than Chamberlain, and believed that he was fighting like a class war because Buster Kilrain was an Irish immigrant, and yeah, he believed he was sticking it to the gentleman or something by fighting that war. So and Buster Kilrain dies, but he well he was wounded in the Battle of Gettysburg, and then thought Chamberlain, I guess, thought he would have lived because they had talked, and then they said goodbyes because he Kilrain went on to go to the hospital, and he died in the hospital of his wounds. And he but he was certainly an influence on Chamberlain's life, just thinking about what this war meant, because Chamberlain believed that this war was about equality, and before the battle or during the battle, they meet this runaway slave who doesn't speak English, and Kilrain guesses that he might have been in America for 5 weeks, and he was wounded. He was shot apparently by a Pennsylvania woman, and Chamberlain, in his mind, was thinking, "My God, this is what it's all about." Because from his perspective, he's from Maine, right? And there were barely any black people there. There were some black people. The blacks in the city kept to themselves, and he knew one black man with a white wife, who lived in on a farm in the countryside. And Kilrain says, "I don't know many blacks that I respect that much, but there are some that I do respect." At least that's Kilrain's position, but it doesn't. I feel like it doesn't highlight how much racism there was in the Union Army. At least that, I mean, that was just Chamberlain's perspective, and he believed he was that the war was about slavery, and after their battle, in which he and his brother survive, and I think his brother is promoted all the way to lieutenant in this, and at least in this book. His brother asks one of the captured rebels that so you're fighting for slavery, right? And the rebel the rebels insisted, no, no, we're fighting for our rats. And Tom tells his older brother, they're fighting for the rats. But I mean, that's what, at least that's what I first heard. But then what they're really fighting for are their rights. And and Tom said, I asked them, what rights are they fighting for? And they couldn't answer. But they were sure it wasn't about slavery. So it shows the South didn't believe they were fighting for. Many Southerners didn't believe they were fighting for slavery. Now, maybe, I guess this scene kind of illustrates that maybe some of them were being manipulated by rich and smarter men in the South who may have been slave owners, but it just shows that there were different perspectives of the war um, during that time, and um, well, and I guess the last thing I'll say, oh man, there's it's a lot. These books are long, but last thing I'll say about Killer Angels was Robert E. Lee's view, and it's Robert E. Lee's, I guess, biggest defeat, because if he had won the Battle of Gettysburg, the course of history might have changed, and there might be a separate Confederacy in the South today. And I remember they recently took down uh, Robert E. Lee's statue in Richmond, and Donald Trump had issued a statement saying if if that General Lee was a very good general, and if not for Gettysburg, for his defeat at Gettysburg, history might have been different. And he said that President Lincoln had wanted him to serve as the general in chief of the Union Army, as the commander of the Union Army, but because he was loyal to Virginia, he couldn't do that. And what's interesting is, I remember in Gods and Generals, Virginia had not. He only succeeds the day of Virginia. He declines Lincoln's offer the day of the day of it secedes. So he didn't when he declined. He didn't even know. He didn't even truly know that they were going to secede. Virginia was going to secede, and he joined the Virginia militia. He declined the Union post because to join the Virginia militia. But anyways, in the Battle of Gettysburg, this was his a great defeat. And then if he had won, history might have changed. I remember like the scene at the very beginning. There was a woman from Pennsylvania who asks for his signature, and then he gives it, but Robert E. Lee thinks, do you even know what I'm doing here? I'm literally invading you. But he after he dies, General Longstreet. General Longstreet becomes the most hated man in the South because this is years after 1870 when Robert E. Lee dies, because he blames the defeat of at Gettysburg on Robert E. Lee years after he dies, and of course people are not happy about this, and they're not happy that he accepted a federal position under General Grant. I mean, or now president, and like back when Grant became president, and in 1869, and yeah, he became the most hated man in the South. Like this is, and but during an Army of Northern Virginia reunion. He's not invited, but he still shows up, and President Jefferson Davis embraces him with a hug because I mean he wanted. I guess part of it was money that Longstreet had become a Republican and had a federal job. That was part of it, but he believed he was just doing what was the best under the South. He said that the Southern people are a conquered people, and he wanted to just work within the system or something. But I mean, part of it was money, and part of it was his relation. His he was in the same West Point class as General Grant. Um, but okay, I'll now let's segue into the last full measure, in which Grant now is introduced in the trilogy. He's not really mentioned in the first two books, and Grant is famous for his battle. Like, I think I don't even know if it was in the Shenandoah. It was a battle against Albert Sidney Johnston, and in which Albert Sidney Johnston dies, and this uh and this is back in the West, and so um I think from what I understand, General Sherman becomes the leader of the army of the Tennessee or something, or and he in this novel it talks, I guess, like in the background about how Sherman Sherman is friends with Grant, and Grant is promoted to lieutenant general, which is the same rank as George Washington and Winfield Scott. It was a 3-star general, and but Grant is put by Lincoln, and he's promoted there, and then he goes to the Battle of the Army of Virginia, and the Union papers, even the Union papers, would describe him as a butcher because he would fight a war of attrition with Lee, and Lee was supposed to be, had a reputation of winning a lot of battles, and in the background, Sherman details Sherman's victory of like Atlanta, like capturing Atlanta and sacking it in Georgia, and yeah, it does illustrate his cruelty and how he destroyed the city. Sherman destroyed the city. I talked about this a little bit in the Rise and Fall of the Confederate States, like when I was reviewing that. But that was in the background. Sherman most of the time, General Sherman, and General Grant was he he was kind of doing a war of attrition. Many men died under him, and his wife had said, "What do I tell all the widows? There's so many widows, and they approach me." And then Grant says, "So I don't try not to think about it too much, because in every war, there will be men that he commands, and they will die." And um, the Confederates were running out of supplies, and eventually this leads to Robert E. Lee's surrender. But it illustrates the events right before that, where they, I guess, send letters to each other, Lee and Grant, and Lee asks for his terms, but doesn't outright say it was terms for surrender. And yeah, and Grant was puzzled. Why is he doing this? But he, but they eventually meet in Appomattox, and Lee is wearing his suit, a new suit with a like his suit, a clean suit with a red sash and a sword, and his and he's and yeah, he meets Grant, and Grant asks, "Do you remember me? I was a captain in Mexico." And then he said, "No, I don't." And then Lee says, "Okay, let's skip the small talk. Let's give me your terms." And then they he writes out his terms, and then Lee asks, "Will the cavalry be able to keep their animals? Many of these are personal animals." And Grant said, under these terms, no, not right now, but I but any animal. But then later he says any animal that can be claimed, that is claimed, will be theirs. Will be like because the Lee had asked him for to let them keep their animals, the cavalry to keep their private animals like the horses, because it would be because they would need it for when they go back to their farms. And these were private animals, right? These didn't belong to the Confederate Army. And then Grant assured him that they would. And the thing about Grant is that he did have deep respect for General Robert E. Lee, and then in his mind at least he said, um, "You do not men do not create honor. Honor creates you." And he says he sees that he's he sees in when he sees Robert E. Lee, he he understands immediately why the Confederate soldiers would fight and die for him, because he was a gentleman, that he fought for what he believed in. And I guess I should mention before going on, when Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, he well, he was wounded during the Battle of Gettysburg, but then he's well, no, not the Battle of Gettysburg. I don't remember what he was wounded in, but he he was wounded under Grant, and then Grant thinks he's dead, so he promotes him to brigadier general, and he didn't even and he receives he I mean, he's honored. Chamberlain's honored, but he kind of feels bad because because Grant apparently never promotes someone on the field, so he believed he believed Grant promoted him because he believed he was dead. But uh yeah, there was also some fighting by Chamberlain, and at this point, I think his brother had become a captain. Uh, but um, what else can I say? The last full measure, it's not gonna get a movie. I don't think it's, but Grant it after the surrender at Appomattox, Grant is well, it also shows, I guess, conversations between Lee and Davis, and well, before Appomattox, and also Grant and Lincoln, and Davis made Lee general in chief of the whole Confederate Army, because he was gaining in unpopularity, and he had to do that. And he was before this he was trying to micromanage the whole army, but it seemed that he wasn't performing very well. Like, he was trying to do so many things, so much micromanagement, while as um Lincoln Lincoln had told Grant at his promotion to lieutenant general that he would not interfere, and with with um with his handling of the army, because Lincoln kept on relieving commanders, like his generals, including including the popular George McClellan, who would later who would later go against him in the election of 1864 and lose. And the election was talked about because Grant and Lincoln were talking to each other, and they said, and Grant believed that if the Democrats won, they would negotiate immediate peace, in which case the Union would be lost, and that's what. But he won, and the novel doesn't talk about the voter fraud there, but it does bring up how people in the army were allowed to vote, and both the Republicans and Democrats were fine with this. And in fact, the Democrats thought that because McClellan was really popular in the army, that they'd support him. But I don't. But the novel speculates that actually the army people, more of the army people, voted for Lincoln because they wanted to finish this war. But it doesn't really talk about the voter fraud, about how there were troops, like I guess, regulating the elections in certain states. Lincoln was not very popular, but um, it was a close election in 1864, and some people say he won because of voter fraud, but I don't know the details. So um, at the end of the novel, the epilogue, I guess, it talks about what happened to each of the three men. Like, I mean, because it focused on three men. If Gods and Generals focused on four men, like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and Winfield Hancock's. Then this novel, the sequel by Jeff Shara would be about three men: Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So it talks about the three of them, what happened after the war. Uh, Lee dies in 1870, like due to heart failure. He was responsible for he was like the president of Washington University, which would later be named Washington Lee University, and I think one of his sons would succeed him as president of the university. And the newspapers asked him for his side of the story, but he wouldn't give it because his side of the story would be considered like the true side of the story, and it wouldn't be reconciliation between the North and the South that way. And he dies of like heart failure in 1870, and Grant dies of, I think, cancer of the throat, and it shows a scene of him and Mark Twain, who that was Mark Twain, the famous author, but he had a real legal name which wasn't Mark Twain. I forgot, but they developed a relationship, and they were writing a book together, like Grant's memoirs, and Twain told him to focus on the war because no one wants to hear about his corrupt presidency. 8 years of 8 years of corruption that happened under Grant, and um, and Chamberlain, he dies before the 50th anniversary reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg, and then not long after that, you would have an assassination in Europe, which would spark World War One. But he was visiting the fields of Gettysburg before he died in his 80s, and yeah, there were a lot of Confederates and Union soldiers who survived, and some even saw action in the Spanish American War. Some and others would live to see the World War One. But okay, I guess I'm gonna now move on to my my view as a Canadian. Well, there's this quote. I'm not sure if it's real, by Samuel Chase, the Chief Justice of the United States, appointed by Lincoln, who said that states' rights had died at Appomattox, because that's where Robert E. Lee surrendered, and that wasn't the end of the war, because there were those, because Jefferson Davis and others wanted to still keep fighting, including Richard Taylor, who was a Confederate general. He was the son of Zachary Taylor. And this was what Grant had told Lincoln after the war, but Lincoln actually, at least in this novel, says that he wouldn't want to capture Davis, because he wouldn't want to have him executed for treason, because he wouldn't want to make him a martyr. He does get captured though, Davis, and so does Stevens, but Stevens is released earlier. Like, they captured around the same time, and Davis is imprisoned at Fort Monroe for two years. But yeah, Andrew Johnson certainly didn't want to prosecute him. Andrew Johnson was a senator like Davis, like before the war, and I talked about how they, in their debate near the end, right before Davis leaves, Johnson tells him, "Why are you leaving? We have a majority in the Senate. We can block Lincoln's appointments." Like, we, as in Democrats. And but I was, as I was mentioning earlier, Samuel Chase had said that states' rights had died at Appomattox, and the Liberal MP from Great Britain, Lord Acton, had lamented that the Confederates had lost, and he said, only in states' rights had I found a power to the only way to check the power of a central government, and that was lost when the Confederacy lost. And Lord Acton was famous. No, what had a famous friend at that time, Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, who pretended to be neutral, but no one believed he was neutral when it came to the war. They believed he was a Confederate sympathizer, and he had given a speech saying Jefferson Davis had created a nation. The nation referring to the Confederate States, and I'm thinking that was, I don't know if you can properly call it a nation. Like, I've talked about this in the Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. Jefferson Davis is adamant in denying that the United States was a nation, and that obviously points to how it was a voluntary union of free and independent states. For Jefferson Davis, it was about independence. Actually, the novel talks about the Hampton Roads Conference a bit, with there were three Confederates who were sent by Davis. One of them was the Assistant Secretary of War. The other one was, I think, a former United States House of Representatives speaker, and then the shortest one was Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, who actually was a former Whig and was friends with Lincoln, and actually kind of wanted, and at Georgia's secession convention, he actually argued in favor of staying in the Union, partly because of the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, and he believed that slavery was better protected in the Union. But yeah, it talks about and how Lincoln had told Stephens that we can put off slavery for decades to come, this issue, as long as you come back into the Union. But Stevens kind of was sympathetic to that idea, but he knew that Jefferson Davis would not agree to that. Jefferson Davis wanted independence, but um, I also remember reading recently um, this blog post on the Abbeville Institute. I don't remember the full name, but it was Ask a Canadian, and it talked about John A. Macdonald's view on the nature of the United States, and he said that um, that like John A. Macdonald, actually favor a legislative union, as in a unitary state, rather than a federal union. But we have a completely different culture and language and other differences from Lower Canada, which would become Quebec. So that's why we're going to have a federal union, talking about the establishment of Canada and the Dominion of Canada, and in and there were constitutional talks in Charlottetown in 1864, but sorry, that's Quebec City in 1864, and then it was finalized in July 1st, 1867, in Charlottetown. The British North America Act, which established the Dominion of Canada. Now, look, the war, the the people at the convention, most of them seem to be centralizers, like Macdonald. But they did still see the need for federalism, especially because Lower Canada, which would be Quebec, was very different, like at least linguistically and culturally, like culturally as in Catholic, while Upper Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick were more Protestant, and there were some other differences, but there's a reason why it's a federation. Canada is a federation, and even though they saw that they believed that states' rights was the reason for the war in the South, in America, they still believed it was important to have a federation rather than a unitary state. I mean, if MacDonald really had his way, they would be a unitary state from sea to sea. You know what I mean? All the way to British Columbia, one central government, supreme in everything. But it's good that we don't have that. Now I know that there's a secessionist movement in Alberta. Paul Hinman, leader of the Wild Rose Independence Party, is pushing for secession. And he's saying, yeah, Jason Kenney. He believes Jason Kenney, the premier of Alberta, is very pro federalist, and that he's looking for another federal job in the future. And also, yeah, Paul Hinman's against vaccine passports, so I kind of like him, more than kind of like that. That certainly understates my view, but obviously the people of Alberta should decide their destiny. I believe in right to self determination, right? I'm obviously if I'm gonna call this Canadian meets the South, I obviously believe in states' rights, and it's not merely a Southern principle. It's just that um, the principle of states' rights is strongest in the South. So yeah, that's my view, and yeah, obviously there was the New England was asserting states' rights during the Battle of 1812, the War of 1812, and the Connecticut legislature had written that Connecticut was a free, sovereign, and independent state, and it was defying the Madison administration and the federal government. But I mean but like this the last full measure and the Killer Angels, like this war, at least in the Killer Angels, he's saying that it wasn't completely about states' rights, and sure, um, at least like one of the thoughts by one of them, and I don't remember which, but it was the war was essentially one side, the Union, was invading the southern side, the Confederacy, because uh they believe the Union they believe that the Union was separate and indivisible. They the northern people, like there was this there's this debate with that Daniel Webster had with Robert C. Hayne of South Carolina, and Daniel Webster had said that unity in one or something like liberty and is like some collectivist slogan about how the union is indivisible, and oh, I guess this later led to one nation under God, but being pushed by Francis Bellamy, the socialist minister who authored the uh, the Oath of Allegiance. But I mean that's another topic for another time. Um, I guess I'm cheering, I guess, for Alberta, for like the Alberta independence movement to be strong, because we need in Canada decentralization, just like in the United States. Now, the federal government is really big in the United States as well, but at least you have strong men who are like fighting the federal government, like Florida's Ron DeSantis, well, and I guess Kristi Noem in South Dakota, and Greg Abbott in Texas. They're fighting for the independence of their state against an oppressive federal government, like such as like Joe Biden issuing like pushing forward a vaccine mandate for corporations with over 100 employees through OSHA, which I don't remember what it's a which it's like this occupational health and safety administration. But yeah, I we both Canada and the United States need to further decentralize their federations. That's my view, because I believe in the right to self determination, and this is the right that the American founding generation fought for. But anyway, that's my review of The Killer Angels by Michael Shara and The Last Full Measure by Jeff Shara. I I hope you look. I hope you continue watching these videos or listening on Anchor.fm or wherever you listen to this podcast. Thanks, and bye for now.